There is a language no linguist could fully explain. It sounds like English, but it isn't. It sounds like West African dialects, but it isn't exactly that either. Scholars spent over a century trying to place it and kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. It doesn't fit anywhere. And that was just the language. Off the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida, there exists a narrow strip of land, sea islands, marshland, places the mainland world largely forgot. The people who live there, the Gullah Geechee, have inhabited this corridor for over 300 years. They kept their culture intact, their foodways, their spiritual practices, their music, their speech. For generations, historians explain this as remarkable, but straightforward. Enslaved Africans, isolated on coastal plantations, preserved fragments of the cultures they came from, cut off from the wider American world, they simply held on it. Was a beautiful explanation, logical, respectful. It was also incomplete when geneticists began running ancestry analysis on Gullah Geechee communities in the late 2000s and into the 2010s. They expected to confirm what the history books already said. African ancestry, predominantly West and Central African, as with most African American populations. Some small European mixture from the plantation era, perhaps. Faint traces of indigenous ancestry. What they found matched some of that, but not all of it. There were signals in the data that didn't align with the standard transatlantic slave trade narrative, specific HLA group distributions, regional African clustering patterns that pointed not just broadly to West Africa, but to precise, narrow corridors within it. Corridors that the historical shipping records didn't fully account for. The data was asking a question that history hadn't thought to ask. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what makes the Gullah Geechee unusual even before the genetics. Most African American populations, through forced migration, sale between plantations, and the general brutality of American slavery, experienced profound cultural disruption over generations. Languages were suppressed. Family structures were destroyed deliberately. Names were taken. Entire lineages were severed. This was not accidental. It was policy. And yet the Gullah Geechee retained something that almost no other enslaved population in North America retained at this scale: a living, functional Creole language, a coherent spiritual system with clear African roots, and a relationship to land and ecology that bore the unmistakable structure of specific African knowledge traditions. How the isolation argument only goes so far. Other isolated communities, Appalachian communities, remote island populations in New England, lost their old world connections within a generation or two. The Gullah Geechee did not. Something else was happening. The first theory, and still the most common one, is the geographic isolation hypothesis. The sea islands, the argument goes, were physically difficult to access. Malaria was endemic. White planters and overseers avoided these places whenever possible, delegating supervision to black drivers and creating by default spaces where African culture could breathe. Isolation preserved the culture. This is almost certainly part of the truth. But consider, isolation explains preservation. It does not explain specificity. When Gullah Geechee spiritual practices are analyzed, they show not generic West African influence. They show specific Yoruba, Mende, and Congo structural elements. When the food traditions are examined, the crops, the preparation methods, the ecological knowledge embedded in rice cultivation, they point to a particular agricultural zone in West Africa. When linguists trace the grammar of Gullah Creole, they find systematic patterns that mirror Sierra Leonean Creole in ways that cannot be explained by accident. This is not cultural memory in the general sense. This is cultural memory in the specific sense, which brings us to the second theory, the Rice Coast hypothesis. In the early 18th century, South Carolina planters faced a problem. They wanted to grow rice on the sea islands, but they didn't know how. Rice cultivation, specifically the cultivation of African rice, or Risa glaberma, requires knowledge of tidal flooding cycles, knowledge of soil preparation, knowledge of the particular ecology of low-lying coastal marshland. Planters in Charleston began specifically requesting, in some cases paying premiums, for enslaved people from the rice coast of West Africa, what is today Sierra Leone, Guinea, Senegal. People who carried in their bodies and their minds generations of agricultural knowledge that no European farmer possessed. This was not a humanitarian gesture. It was extraction of expertise, but it had an unintended consequence. By deliberately concentrating people from a specific, relatively narrow region of West Africa onto the Sea Islands, the planters inadvertently created something they hadn't planned for. A community with shared cultural roots, shared language families, shared spiritual frameworks. Not a random mix of Africans stripped of context, but something closer to a coherent cultural transplant. This theory is compelling. Historians like Daniel Littlefield have documented it extensively. The shipping records, imperfect as they are, support it. And yet, even this doesn't fully account for what the genetics are now showing. Because here is where the data becomes genuinely surprising. A 2016 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, along with subsequent work by researchers at the Family Tree DNA African Ancestry Project, began mapping haplogroup distributions across African American populations with greater resolution than had previously been possible. When Gullah Geechee communities were analyzed specifically, the results showed something that separated them statistically from African American populations in the interior South. The Gullah Geechee showed elevated frequencies of haplogroups, both mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages that are today concentrated in specific regions of Sierra Leone and the Senegambia. This was consistent with the Rice Coast narrative, but there was more. Within those African lineages, the genetic clustering was unusually tight. What this means in plain language is that many Gullah Geechee individuals share common ancestors, not just at the level of a broad regional population, but at the level of specific, identifiable communities within West Africa. The diversity you would expect from the general slave trade, where people from dozens of distinct ethnic groups were deliberately mixed to prevent solidarity, was compressed in Gullah Geechee communities. This suggests something more targeted than even the Rice Coast hypothesis fully explains. Imagine standing in a village in what is today Sierra Leone in the year 1720. You are men. Your community has cultivated this particular coastal landscape for generations. You know which plants grow where. You know how water moves through rice fields in the rainy season. You know the names of the spirits connected to this land. And then, in a matter of months, a significant portion of your community is gone. Not scattered randomly across an ocean, but transported together to a landscape in South Carolina that looked in some eerie ways remarkably similar to the one you left. The same tidal creeks, the same coastal marshes, the same low, flat horizon. Your knowledge was the reason you were taken, and your knowledge in this new place was the reason you survived, and were paradoxically given a degree of operational autonomy that other enslaved people were not. This is not a theory. The autonomy is documented. Gullah Geechee communities ran the rice operations. They directed the work. They trained new arrivals. And in doing so, they maintained social structures and lines of cultural transmission that would have been impossible in other plantation contexts. The isolation didn't just preserve the culture preserved itself because the culture was too economically valuable to destroy. This is the twist that changes everything. The Gullah Geechee weren't simply lucky survivors of cultural erasure. In a brutal and deeply ironic historical reversal, their specific expertise, the very knowledge that made them targets for enslavement, became the mechanism of their cultural continuity. Their captives needed them to mend, needed them to know the rice, needed them to speak to each other, to organize, to pass knowledge down. And in creating those conditions for exploitation, they inadvertently created the conditions for one of the most remarkable acts of cultural persistence in the history of the Atlantic world. The DNA is now providing the biological confirmation of what cultural anthropologists had begun to suspect. This was not a random diaspora community that happened to preserve fragments. This was a coherent population drawn from a narrow geographic and ethnic origin that reconstructed functional cultural continuity in a new landscape, because the social and ecological conditions, however horrific their cause, made that reconstruction possible. There is a moment that researchers at the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, the federal designation that now protects this community, describe when they bring DNA results back to elders in the community. It isn't surprise that they encounter, it's recognition. One woman, an elder on St. Helena Island in South Carolina, reportedly looked at a genetic ancestry result showing a primary cluster in the Sierra Leone, Guinea coastal region and said simply, "That's where the rice knowledge comes from. We always knew that." The science arrived after 300 years at a place the community had never entirely left. There is still so much the genetics cannot tell us. The specific villages, the specific families, the precise routes by which particular haplogroups traveled from particular places. The records are incomplete, Deliberately so, because the system that created this diaspora had no interest in preserving the humanity of the people it moved. But the DNA is a kind of record that could not be destroyed. It passed through every generation, through every attempt to sever, to separate, to erase. It carried in its sequences a geography, a homeland, a specificity that no amount of historical violence could fully obliterate. And what it tells us now is that the Gullah Geechee story is not simply a story about survival. It is a story about the limits of eraser, about the ways that knowledge, agricultural, linguistic, spiritual, genetic, moves through time in forms that are more durable than the systems designed to suppress them. The question this raises is larger than one community. If the Gullah Geechee retain this much, this specifically, this coherently, what does that suggest about other African diaspora communities whose cultural continuities are less visible, less documented, less celebrated? What knowledge is embedded in foodways and musical structures and spiritual practices that we have not yet had the tools or the will to properly trace? The DNA is becoming that tool, slowly, imperfectly, but with a kind of precision that is beginning to rewrite histories that were written the first time by people with every incentive to leave certain things out. The Gullah Geechee were never simply what the history books describe. They were never simply an isolated remnant preserved by accident on forgotten islands. They were and are a living archive of a place, of a people, of a form of knowledge that crossed an ocean under conditions designed to make such crossings impossible. And the data is only beginning to tell us how deep that archive goes.